Okay, if I don't see any, hear anybody shouting that they don't see, assume you see. Yeah, all good?
All good.
Oh, good, perfect. Okay. So yeah, what I thought I'd do in my talk is try to basically weave the different attributes of sustainable diets together. We already heard about the many challenges of the food system. I mean, it's, as we all know, woefully environmentally unsustainable, a major driver of climate change, major driver of environmental degradation, including land use, biodiversity loss, water use, and pollution. And at the same time, the food system fails to deliver healthy and nutritious diets, with dietary risk being a leading risk factor for premature mortality, the prevalence of overweight and obesity continuing to increase, undernourishment remaining a persistent problem, and healthy diets being unaffordable for many of the world's poor. The concept of sustainable diets, and that was sort of the, I guess, one of the first concepts before now we talk about inclusive diets, was actually intended to address all of those challenges, in particular the environmental health and social challenges of the food system. So according to the FAO, sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts, which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. They are protective and respectful for biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and unaffordable, and so on. So it's lots of stuff, lots of environmental health and social aspects weaved together to the degree that about this concept of sustainable diets, or any concept, and including concept of inclusive diets, we can ask, is this actually all pie in the sky, or do such diets or such attributes of diets really make any sense? So that's what I want to look at in this talk. And I want to go through the different dimensions, really, of health, environmental, and social dimensions of dietary change. When it comes to the health dimension, well, it's clear that dietary risks are leading risk factor for non-communicable diseases and premature mortality. If you put diet and weight-related risk factors together, and both of them are related to what we eat, what one tells us, gives information about the wrong stuff we eat, and one about over or under eating. If you put the two together, then they are responsible for about 1 in 4 premature deaths globally, and different so in different regions. What is very clear is that dietary changes towards better balanced, calorie balanced, nutritional balanced, and more plant-based diets with a better composition of foods can address those dietary and weight-related risk factors and lead to a similarly sized reduction in diet-related diseases. And here we find that, you know, there are different dietary patterns that can do that, and most of them have in common that they're predominantly plant-based, like flexitarian, vegetarian, pescatarian, or vegan, as you see on this slide. Those same dietary patterns have been associated in modeling studies with improvements in nutritional adequacy. So also from that side, you can say, yeah, dietary changes can actually contribute to addressing diet-related risk and nutritional intake. Again, you can use various different recommendations or surveys of what we think healthy diets are. The Eat-Lancet Commission is a good starting point for that, and those recommendations that are fairly general and that include, for example, not more than 1 serving of red meat per week, not more than 2 of poultry per week, not more than 2 of fish per week, and not more than 1 serving of milk per day, and plenty of fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds, and oils with unsaturated fatty acids. Those general recommendations were based on a fairly comprehensive review of the health literature and are compatible with either flexitarian diets, vegetarian diets, vegan diets. So they provide a good starting point and are broadly healthy and nutritionally adequate. When it comes to the environmental side of things, things get a bit more complex. Here we know that if we don't change course, we risk exceeding key planetary boundaries related to climate change, water use, land use, and biodiversity loss, and biogeochemical flows related to nitrogen and phosphorus that come, for example, from fertilizer application. What is clear is we can only manage to stay within those key environmental limits if we put all measures to bear. And those include, importantly, dietary changes towards more plant-based diets. Without those, we wouldn't be able to avoid dangerous levels of climate change. But for other environmental domains like land use, water use, nitrogen and phosphorus application, those also include technological changes, reductions in food loss and waste, and maybe some socioeconomic changes like different income and population trajectories. So those don't have to do with diets or dietary change. And where do those come from? Well, technological changes are so important for some of those environmental domains because there is this a super unequal distribution of technology and capital. This shows you yield gaps around the world, and you can see here how inefficient, and yield gaps tell you how much crop you can get out from a given piece of land, given the climatic conditions at a place. And here you can see that crop production is fairly inefficient in broadly the global south. So that doesn't have anything to do with diets or dietary change. This is just unequal distribution of technologies and capital. Similar when we look at food loss and waste, lots of it has to do with lack of infrastructure, like insufficient storage or cold chains. And again, those impact, when we talk about losses, mostly low and middle income countries. When it comes to socioeconomic changes, there it's often lack of access to education and health service, for example, to reproductive health services, again, in low-income countries. So also this bit that would contribute to us staying within planetary boundaries is not related to dietary changes. Then lastly, the social dimension. And here we have done some studies on the affordability of different dietary patterns. What we have seen is that in higher income countries, like high income and upper middle income countries, dietary changes can actually reduce the cost of diets. So different dietary patterns, and here's a selection of different different predominantly plant-based dietary patterns, similar to those that I showed you earlier, would be associated with up to a 30% reduction in the cost of diets in those higher income countries. So it's only pescatarian diets were actually more expensive there. Whereas in lower income countries, if you look at the prices of foods in those markets, there any diet that would change from the usually fairly monotonic diets would be associated with an increase. Those healthier and more sustainable dietary patterns were associated with less of an increase than, for example, a high-income diet, but they're currently not affordable. What could be done about, and this is how this looks like when you look at that at a map, fairly not all that dissimilar than the yield gap map that I showed you earlier. What can help to make diets affordable? Well, not really more dietary changes, because one would be interested that all countries have access to healthy diets. So it's again food system changes that would need to make a contribution here. This shows you how the situation will change with less food loss and waste, a bit higher economic development, and the full cost accounting of foods, where you price in basically the health and climate change costs that would help make less healthy and less sustainable foods more expensive, whilst keeping health healthy and sustainable foods broadly at the same price. So all of those three food system measures would help to improve affordability to 2030 and result in a situation where basically healthy and sustainable dietary patterns would be affordable for basically every country in 2050. So with that, let's go back to the initial question. So can sustainable diets, or the concept of sustainable or inclusive diets, as for this session, actually deliver? I think it's clear by now that dietary changes towards balanced and predominantly plant-based diets can deliver a really large set of things, like reductions in dietary risks, in nutritional shortfalls, in greenhouse gas emissions, environmental resource use and pollution, and also in the cost of diets. However, they cannot address, dietary changes alone cannot address a whole lot of things as well. So it cannot address the environmental impacts related to poor farming practices and food losses. That is very much related to the agricultural system. It can't address too high food prices in certain regions of the world, especially of healthy and sustainable foods, which is very much related to how the economic system is set up at the moment. And it can't address food security issues that are very often related to a lack of infrastructure and conflict, which is very much related to the political system. So in order to bring that all under one banner, a multi-system perspective with a comprehensive food system changes is very much needed to deliver diets that address all of those and that are healthy and nutritionally adequate, but also environmentally sustainable, accessible and affordable and inclusive for all. So with that said, the concept of sustainable diets as a concept really only makes sense if you think of it as dietary changes combined with food system changes. Or if you don't like the concept, or you don't like the concept of inclusive diets, then one can also clearly say that, well, diets can actually only be healthy. They can't be anything else. And other attributes very much depend on food system characteristics, like, and those attributes include environmental sustainability, social and economic viability, and inclusiveness is very much part of this later attribute. So I guess with that, I would plead to basically be very clear what we mean when we talk about how diets can be, and if we actually mean dietary changes or food system changes or both. So I stop here. If you want to look at further detail, please have a look at our studies, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marco. That was a great talk, and really explored the question of affordability in particular from multiple angles. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Lora Iannotti from Washington University in St. Louis. Lora.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Let me make sure that I'm okay. Please let me know if you're unable to see that. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really a privilege to be able to speak to you today. The title of my talk is Sustainable Inclusive Diets for Young Children, and I'll talk about our research in Kenya with the Samaki Salama Project. So in the presentation, I'd like to first introduce to you the sort of global situation focused on child nutrition and as an especially vulnerable group, discuss the importance of animal source foods in child diets with a view towards what Dr. Springmann just talked about, which is this debate right now and emphasis on plant-based diets. And then go through the Samaki Salama research that we're doing, where we're protecting both marine ecosystems and child nutrition, and conclude with a couple of paradigms and some policy work with UN Nutrition and FAO. So my lab is the E3 Nutrition Lab, and we do research focused on maternal and young child nutrition interventions, upholding these tenets of equity, evolution, and the environment. Equitable access to foods, evolutionarily appropriate foods, but then importantly, environmentally sustainable diets. We do research in Ecuador, Haiti, Kenya, and Madagascar. And then at the global level, policy work with WHO, FAO, and UN Nutrition. So I think we'll hear repeatedly today about the problems of malnutrition and how they differentially affect different population groups. So we have nearly 150 million children with stunted growth and chronic malnutrition. And this number, for the first time in a long time, has increased by 5.2 million. But then there are 250 million with stunted development. And I'm going to talk a little bit about brain development and the importance of certain nutrients for the brain. 45 million are wasted, but then on the other end of the spectrum, we're seeing tremendous increases in overweight and obesity. At the intersection of undernutrition and overweight and obesity, though, is this problem of hidden hunger and the access to poor quality foods. So the global nutrition targets, there are 7, and 5 of those relate to the nutrition of young children. Progress is being made on these outcomes and these targets, but we have considerable distance to go when it comes to anemia, exclusive breastfeeding, stunting, and others. So as I mentioned to you, early brain development happens rapidly and is highly dependent actually on nutrition. And what we see is that brain growth occurs prenatally in the red line, where structurally a child brain reaches the size of an adult brain by 2 years of age. But synaptic growth peaks and plateaus at 2 years, and myelination continues through adolescence and plateaus. Nutrition and particular nutrients are important for both macrostructure of the brain and microstructure. So nutrients affect neuroanatomy, neurochemistry, neurophysiology, and neuronal performance. And a lack of these nutrients can compromise any of these functions of the brain. These are some examples of the nutrients that are really critical in early brain development for the child. And you can see that several of them are found in certain animal source foods like fish with docosahexaenoic acid, iron and zinc found highly bioavailable in animal source foods, important for those outcomes with the brain, and then choline as well for neurotransmission and acetylcholine, sphingomyelin, and DNA methylation. So moving now to animal source foods and the importance for young children. We want to really focus on nutrition in the life course. I think so much of this debate has really dwelled in this sort of adult stage, which is very important. And thinking about sustainable, healthy diets in adults is probably critical in terms of reversing trends at the moment. However, we cannot neglect certain periods of the life course where these foods are vital for healthy growth and brain development, and that includes early childhood, but also older adults. I want to point to that life phase because I think it's been neglected, and there's very compelling, strong evidence from animal source foods and the health of older adults in preventing sarcopenia, for example, and also, again, preserving memory, and preventing dementia. So why these animal source foods? Well, as Dr. Springmann just mentioned, there's an affordability question that we have to consider, and also thinking about sustainable animal source foods and the renewable ones that we can continue to go back to the same animal for, or pull from lower trophic levels, as is the case of smaller fish. With regards to young children, it's critical that we think about the nutrient matrix and the bioavailability of animal source foods. So vitamin A being the great example, where as carotenoids, you need 12 to 24 times the quantity of carotenoids to get to 1 retinol equivalent for absorption. Similarly, this is true for iron and zinc, where we better absorb the nutrients delivered in animal source foods. And for children with small gastric capacity, that's very important that there are these efficient delivery mechanisms offered by some of these animal source foods. So in Ecuador, we showed that 1 egg per day for 6 months increased length for age Z-score, linear growth by 0.63 and reduced stunting by 47%. And what you can see is that there's a public health effect here in that the whole distribution shifted to the right for length for age Z-score. And then undergirding that effect, validating it in a sense, was the increase in the biomarkers of choline and docosahexaenoic acid. Unfortunately, though, as this topic of this event is that there are disparities around the world in terms of who is getting access to these foods. And you can see that portrayed in these graphs. So moving now to Samaki Salama and the case study. This is funded by Feed the Future, USAID, and my partners are Pawnee University, Egerton University, and University of Rhode Island. The context is the coast of Kenya, where stunting prevalence is very high among children less than 5 years of age at 39%, which is below the national average of 26%. There's low biodiversity, and there's destruction to the ecosystem and the marine fisheries in particular that we're paying attention to. This study that has just recently been completed was a cluster randomized controlled trial, and we had a control group, and then we had a social marketing for nutrition behavior change, and then a third group that added the modified fishing traps that you can see in the picture here. And essentially, this allows for the juvenile fish to escape, thereby, in theory, protecting the marine ecosystem. In the social marketing, we were also promoting Taffy, which is rabbitfish, a fish that's in the lower trophic level, again, in view of this sort of sustainable approach to young child diets and animal source foods and young child diets. So here are our sites in coastal Kenya. Again, highly vulnerable population with extremely high rates of diarrhea that we're still puzzling over. Here's some images from our social marketing intervention that included messaging around diet diversity, importance of animal source foods, cooking demonstrations, messaging through community health workers, and then also fisher workshops. The fishers were really interested in this. Once again, the traps that were used to allow the juvenile fish to escape. Some very early preliminary findings show that, in fact, the intervention group, the yield was much higher, but very importantly, the length of the fish was greater. So the fish are older, and we are protecting the ecosystem. I can't present the nutrition results yet, but it's looking good in terms of the intervention. So in summary, we were aiming at long fish and long children in this study. Okay, so to conclude, I just want to just conclude with a couple of new sort of paradigms that relate to these food systems that the others in this panel will be talking about and have talked about. We need to think about transforming our food systems. And if we think in terms of nourishing biomes, so the feeding reciprocity with our biomes and ecological stoichiometry, so those nutrient flows that Dr. Springmann mentioned, and ecosystem harmonies. There's some examples of this, great examples of this out there in terms of how one can exist in tandem with your ecosystem. And gatherer hunter-fisher groups in Fiji, territorial diets, Nordic and Mediterranean, the Quechua and Pachamama in Ecuador, and then in my state of Missouri, the Osage Nation tribe. Here at WashU, we're trying hard to eat and grow local, but we're not quite there yet. Only about 22% of our food is local. And then the second paradigm is the linkages between biodiversity and diet diversity. And if we're sincere about sustainable, healthy diets, then we really work hard to blend metrics that cut across biodiversity and diet diversity, such as species richness as an example. And our lab is doing some research in Madagascar on this question. And then finally, it's important for researchers like myself to work at the policy level. And we're doing this with UN Nutrition and FAO to think hard about these issues. So with that, I thank you very much. I acknowledge my collaborators, appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Anna. That was a great talk. And we will now move to our next presenter, who is Dr. Pauline Scheelbeek from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Laura, you might need to stop sharing your screen. And
Yes, I know. I'm trying to. There we go. Okay,
that should have worked. All right,
Yeah.
Pauline, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me try and find my presentation. Is that all right?
Yes, we can see your slides, but you might want to go into slideshow mode. Perfect.
Yeah, is that in slideshow mode now?
Yes, but we can also see the upcoming slide on the
Oh yeah.
right.
How do I change that again? Yeah, is that better?
Yes, that's perfect.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry for the delay in that, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk. So I saw the lineup of incredible speakers, and so I've picked a particular sort of theme that my research group is currently involved with, and our partners all over the world. But very happy to also discuss other parts of our work in the upcoming Q&A. And so what I decided to talk about today is looking a little bit more at the behavior change side of things. And as Marco rightly pointed out, it's not only about consumers. And Jess also touched upon this. It's obviously we're looking at big food system changes to reach both our health and our environmental targets, but consumers are part of it, of course, and there is a lot that we know already about what sort of diets consumers could or maybe should or maybe like to eat, both for health and an environmental benefit. And so we've seen this now a number of times today, and the research that we're doing around dietary behavior change very much comes from the sort of idea that that all small bits together, of course, cause a big transformational change. And so the power of consumers, we're now, well, as of yesterday or so, 8 billion people on the planet. And there's a lot of evidence out there, just nicely presented by my colleagues, about predominantly plant-based diets. There are different guidelines, but they all have certain things in common, that, for example, a large part of the daily diet should comprise of plant-based foods, fruits and vegetables, legumes, maybe also nuts and seeds. And despite all of this evidence, there is quite a discrepancy between what in theory we would like to see people eating and what is currently happening, including in the UK, and I will draw from some examples from our research in the UK. So as I said before, despite the abundant evidence and also an increased interest in healthy and sustainable eating, and Jess mentioned something about that already. You see here on the left side the Google search index for people looking for the search term sustainable diets, and that has increased a lot in many different countries, and also globally you see an increase there. But it does not really reflect consumption patterns to date. And on the right-hand side, you see, for example, a study that we did a few years ago, where we looked at adherence to the Eat Well guide, which are the food-based dietary guidelines for the UK. They are closer to current diets than the Eat Lancet recommendations are, and yet you see we evaluated 9 of their recommendations, and you see that people that adhere to 8 to 9 recommendations, but it's almost invisible on the graph. It was 0.06% that were adhering to all 9 of those. And And we believe that part of that is also because we, in the past, for very good reasons, have been doing a lot of modeling work, looking at the sort of gap to bridge, and also the sort of leap that we could take if we were to convince people to eat more plant-based based diet. But there was less of a focus on actual consumer involvement, the use of empirical data, and the use of sort of champions, so people that have found their ways to plant-based diets already without maybe major severe taxation strategies or subsidy strategies, etc. But I'll come back to that later. And as I said, it is remarkable, especially because there is a lot of evidence around this, that better adherence is related to better health outcomes, also presented by the speakers before. This is the particular one for better adherence to the Eat Well guide in the UK, and you see that's related to a decrease in all risk mortality, and also a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions or dietary footprints, with water footprints quite stable over the different levels of adherence to the Eat Well guide. So why do we see this big a cliff between theory and practice? Well, part of that is because behavior change is really complex, and in diets maybe even more so than in other areas, because even if you want people to stop eating a certain food, they still need to eat. It's a bit more complicated than smoking, where cessation could be zero of this, whereas with diets, there's still you still need your daily dietary intake. And then there's this plethora of social, cultural, economic, food environment factors that influence such diets, which makes it very difficult to unravel what the actual barriers and enablers are for people to start changing their diets towards more predominantly plant-based diets or planetary plates, so to say, as compared to the current diets. However, there are quite a few studies available. This was a systematic review that we did earlier this year, looking specifically at institutions in high-income countries. So this could be hospitals, universities, schools, prisons, where people looked at what can we do in our canteens or food outlets that would increase the uptake of plant-based options without maybe necessarily taking away the animal-sourced ones. And so there were quite a few that turned out to have very positive impact on dietary change, varying from labeling to menu and product placement, for example. So it's not impossible to change diets, but it is interesting to study these mechanisms and find which of those sorts of behavior change mechanisms specifically work for this sustainable and healthy dietary change question. And then there is an issue of supply, and of course I'm very much aware that supply is not, as Marco mentioned as well, is not the only driving force behind dietary choice. It's much more complex than that. But of course, insufficient supply of foods that we want people to eat more of could be a precondition of actually accelerating this sort of behavior change. And in the UK, if you look at the figure on the left, you see the middle column is the total supply of fruit and vegetable, but the right column is what would be needed if we were all to meet this Eat Well guidance. And again, to remind you, that is comprise less plant-based foods than the Eat Lancet guidance. So instinctively, you would say, well, and here is an example of how we kind of proportionally would upscale a local production and imports. And instinctively you would maybe say, well, a domestic production, that sounds like it could be more of a sustainable option. Is that something that we could promote? This is obviously apart from the discussion that would have an impact on trade relationships with lower income countries that are often for a quite large part of their GDP dependent on foreign trade. But even if we were to go that way, there is a bit of an issue related to consumer taste, and where we see that this is a graph from the sort of popularity of different types of fruits and vegetables in the UK, and on the left the most popular one, to the right the least popular one of the top 15. And where you see that tropical fruits mostly, such as bananas, but also pineapples, are kind of gaining in popularity, whereas crops that you would particularly would typically produce in the UK, such as cabbages in green and peas in white, are becoming less and less popular with the consumer. So is that would a supply from especially domestically grown fruits and vegetables help with that sort of dietary transition? Would an extra supply of those particular foods really be appealing to people and make them make these substitutions of certain animal source foods for plant-based foods? And then just to note that plant-based fruits and vegetables used to come in the 1980s from mostly from Europe, with a few other countries further away, whereas now the UK are trading with a lot of countries that are vulnerable to climate change, and this opens a whole other sort of a Pandora box of ethical issues as well. What is happening if yields of very healthy foods are majorly declined because of a specific climate disaster or ongoing climate change, and what's happening to trade them? Will they still export to the UK, potentially causing a nutrient drain in those countries, or will they stop exporting, with of course also consequences for the economy? But then how do we bridge that? What sort of things can we do? And again, some of my colleagues before me have given you some heads up on these positive sort of solution focused research projects already. But so we very much believe in that studying success cases could be useful. And so how do we get from what we see on the left side to what we get on the right side? So we have been focusing our in the past couple of years our research very much on looking at actual consumption, for example, using commercial data such as that provided by Kantar World Panel, where you can identify these sort of dietary change patterns. What do people do? Do they go cold turkey? Do they use those alternative proteins, these vegan sausages and burgers, etc.? Is that a stepping stone? Is that an endpoint of their more plant-based diet? But there's obviously also data out there that are free of charge. In the UK, for example, the NDNS, the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, which has data available for about 15 years now. And of course, a high level of consumer involvement and sometimes targeted consultation of consumers that show particular patterns of dietary change, and we're very much wondering on what enabled them to make that change, or what actually is the threshold for them not to change towards either the guidelines or the planetary plate. And this will very much inform. So these are the sort of models that we've done before, where we say what sort of scenarios would help. the UK reaching targets on sustainable and healthy diets. Well, the purple one would be on sort of behavior change alone, and we do see that there is a decrease in dairy consumption and a decrease in meat consumption, but not not very rapidly. And so we modeled things such as tax and subsidy strategies and innovation, which is everything to do with those novel proteins. But with the more data-driven approaches I showed before, you could much better inform these sort of models, as you will have a much better idea of what's really going on the ground, and also in what sort of difference we see in different population groups. Jess already mentioned the role of plant-based protein. This is very interesting, and we've been diving into this from a European perspective as well, where we see, especially among the younger generations, that the proportion of people reporting to consume these regularly has gone up very steeply over the past 15 years. But there is less there's less of a structural overview of their health, and mostly their health concerns. I think from an environmental perspective, this is better documented, but these products are very often quite easily to reformulate, and so their nutritional content is fluctuates quite a bit from product to product. And this is a systematic review that one of our PhD students completed recently, where she looked at all kinds of different studies with those plant-based alternative foods, and specifically looked at the nutritional content, whilst also mapping that to the reduction in environmental impact. She looked at greenhouse gas, land use, and water use. And you see that also from a health perspective, it looks good, more fiber in these as compared to their animal sourced sort of counterpart food. But also quite often higher in sodium, more often lower in saturated fats. And so we try to slowly develop another sort of classification where these foods are not all kind of grouped together and always mentioned as one food group that people could or could not make use of when they would like to transition from current to more plant-based diets. And this is not, I have to say, this is sort of a preliminary result, and so this infographic might still change, but just to give you a bit of an idea that from a health perspective, there are sort of healthier plant-based alternative protein sources versus less healthy ones, and maybe they should also, if we go forward, if we try to incorporate this into nudging strategies, and so this distinction should also be made, so that they're not sort of a blanket, that there is a blanket approach in promoting or not promoting these sort of foods. And then finally, it's obviously very important to link any of these efforts to policy opportunities. Whilst we all try to influence policy as much as we can, kind of linking it to ongoing developments in the UK, for example, a couple of years ago, the National Food Strategy was developed, which was an integrated strategy looking at the future of the food system, but then including health and environmental and economic perspectives there. And so some of the evidence from that work has also gone into the National Food Strategy, and hopefully also the policy steps that will come out of this. I'm not entirely sure how I'm doing for time.
You have about 3 minutes left.
Oh, perfect. So then I finally wanted to say something, because I realized I was running out of time with my examples from the UK, but we do a lot of work in, for example, South Africa, India, and also the Gambia. This is the Gambia, where part of LSHDM is also based. And very similar work as what I presented, but of course with very different food system challenges to tackle. And so I just wanted to highlight one of the outcomes of a project that we're doing in the Gambia, which is the Food Systems Adaptation in Changing Environments, or FACE Africa project, where we're trying to also find solutions for sustainable and healthy diets, but from a Gambian perspective, much more of a focus on foods that are resilient, foods that require less water use, for example, as these are the sort of limiting factors in the Gambia. And I wanted to show you one of the outputs that have been developed by my colleagues Feliciano and Tony Cole, is in a sort of platform for policymakers where they could play around with different scenarios. It's based on a model that was originally developed by colleagues in IASA, and we've adapted that for the Gambian food system, but also something that hopefully will very much help with identifying what is a healthy and sustainable diet in this context. How could we get consumers to consume this, and how do we need to change the food systems, including production, processing, trade, etc., around it to make this work in a lower income setting. So that's it for me. These are the colleagues that I stole some slides of as well.
Thank you, Pauline. That was a really great introduction to sort of thinking about more broadly about consumer behavior and how that plays into questions of inclusion and sustainability. And with that, I'd like to introduce our last speaker for the session, who is Dr. Anna Herforth from Harvard University. Anna?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to try to share my screen. So I'm going to introduce the cost and affordability of healthy diets today, which I really wanted to bring to this meeting because it's a new indicator that will be tracked globally on an annual basis. And it has some interesting implications around sustainability, which I'll discuss as well. I am the co-director of the Food Prices for Nutrition project, which is a collaboration led at Tufts University with the World Bank and IFPRI. And so I'm presenting today with my hat on from the Food Prices for Nutrition project. And our sites are here listed on the slide in case you want to visit and find a lot more information and publications around this topic. The cost and affordability of a healthy diet are indicators to understand food access, and they are important in this conversation for inclusive diets because they really were created around a general concept of inclusion in terms of food security. They're integrated now into the UN State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World report since the last 3 years, and now institutionalized within FAO, joining other food security metrics of the prevalence of undernourishment, which deals with access to adequate dietary energy, and the food insecurity experience scale-based indicators. So the SOFI reports have included these indicators to expand, really to enable looking at food security as it was envisioned in this aspiration, which was adopted by the world, the member states of the UN in 1996, that food security is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So this definition is really quite relevant when we talk about inclusion and how do we measure the food system so that we can understand whether people have access to nutritious food to meet dietary needs. That was the motivation for this work. And so the specific methods and how we do that are outlined in the background papers that are shown here. And in doing so, we've provided some new targets that are helpful. And they came up in the UN Food Systems Summit last year in terms of a goal of trying to halve the number of people who cannot access a healthy diet and build more actionable targets around not just access to calories, but access to healthy diets as well. So we had to, of course, wrestle with the question, what is a healthy diet, in creating an indicator of the cost and affordability of healthy diets. And fortunately, this question has been answered by many different actors around the world. As Jess mentioned in her introductory presentation today, the majority of countries have dietary guidelines, not all of them, but over 100 countries now have food-based dietary guidelines, which have the purpose of defining what is a healthy diet for citizens of each country. So these guidelines represent, first of all, a realistic way for regular people to select nutrient adequate diets, a way of communicating the proportions of foods to consume in a way that will result in both nutrient adequate diets as well as diets that protect against non-communicable diseases and that are dignified and culturally appropriate. And there's a political economy to starting with the definitions that nations have already published and endorsed, because they are official policy standards for what constitutes dietary needs. And many countries use these standards for social safety nets and nutrition education. So we started with, let's look at how countries around the world have defined a healthy diet. And in order to calculate the cost of what countries have defined as healthy diets, it can be done in two ways. So one way is where countries do have their own quantitative dietary guidelines, such as Ethiopia, which came out with their first ever national dietary guidelines this year. We can use this approach to find out what does it cost at a minimum to actually purchase a diet that would meet those dietary guidelines. Let's not just tell people you should eat diets that meet these dietary guidelines, but figure out whether that's even possible. It doesn't really make sense to tell someone to eat a diet that meets these guidelines if it is not possible within their income and the cost of all the different food groups in the market. So that's one application of these metrics, is at a national level. But then at a global level, we had to say, what is a common standard? We can't just use one country's guidelines to apply to the world. We created an approach called the Healthy Diet Basket, which summarizes dietary guidelines and from multiple countries. And so it represents a proportionality of food groups that are commonalities among many different countries' national guidelines to ensure global comparability in the metric. And this is what is used now in the annual updates to the SOFI reports as a standard of access to nutritious food to meet dietary needs. In order to do that, we looked at many different guidelines that have been quantified around the world, and these are a few of them, and summarized, what in all these different guidelines with the different food groups that are recommended in different amounts, is there a common picture coming through? And we do start to see in the middle there, and if you put all of these charts on top of each other, that we have an average amount of the different food groups which are most commonly recommended across countries. And there were more than 30 countries that have pie chart type food guides where you can actually see the proportionality of the different food groups recommended. So we looked across all those guidelines and took the average recommendations. And it comes out looking like this. In terms of volume, about a half of the plate is fruits and vegetables, about a quarter is starchy staples, and about a quarter is protein-rich foods, both plant and animal source, a small proportion in oils and fats. And this is also the mode of what we see in food guides, where several countries, as you can see in the two pictured here, which are Canada and Poland, that they actually show precisely this: half the plate fruits and vegetables and a quarter each for starchy staples and protein-rich foods. So we take those proportions I showed you the volume visual, but we take the proportions in terms of a constant share of calories. And using those constant proportions for all of the countries around the world, we look at the food items that would be the least cost to meet the quantities that are recommended on average. So we ask, within the food groups, what are the cheapest items? This answer varies by season and by market. So it's not a constant set of items, it's a constant set of food groups with substitutable food items, which we can then add up the cost of the cheapest items in each food group to determine the total cost of a healthy diet that is reflective of the commonalities across dietary guidelines. And if we were to add additional interests, such as taste or preferences or convenience, this would raise the cost and raise the number of people who can't afford the healthy diet. So the metric is really based on the least cost foods in the market. You can see here how that plays out in one time and 3 places. So looking at a data set from 2017 and 3 different countries, we see at that time, these are the items that were least cost in each food group. And the proportions you see are the cost share. So the cost varies by country, but the proportions of each food group stay constant. So you can see, in general, the starchy staples, the oils, and the legumes tend to be lower cost. In Italy, we see pasta and wheat flour being least cost. In Pakistan, maize and wheat flour. In Senegal, maize and rice. The different plant source protein foods, you can see dried white beans in Italy, dal in Pakistan, and groundnuts in Senegal, etc. So you can see that often a lot of the least cost foods tend to be those which you would typically associate with culturally relevant dietary pattern. It's not always the most preferred food items, but they tend to be those that are widely available and also widely consumed, in addition to being least cost. To get these results, we use a unique food price data set. It's the data set of the World Bank's International Comparison Program. It's the only data set in the world which has retail prices across countries. We're working on a longer term plan to try to expand the collection and aggregation of food prices across countries, because food prices are collected by every country on a monthly, if not higher frequency basis. So there's a lot of food price data out there. And the World Bank ICP does this effort to synthesize prices every few years. And so the last time they did this was 2017. And we used this global data set to identify the least cost items across countries. One of the really striking discoveries was that diet costs are not linked to national income of countries. So we see the average income per person, GNI per capita 2017 purchasing power parity on the bottom axis. And the richer countries do not have more expensive diets. It's really a flat line, as you can see, in terms of the least cost healthy diet around the world, which averaged about $3.30 a day in 2017. So food prices are not cheaper in real terms in low-income countries, even though they may appear cheaper at exchange rates. They're in real terms the same as in high-income countries on average. And these costs rose due to food price inflation between 2017 and 2020, but we still see the same pattern that inflation affected pretty much the whole world fairly evenly. And the result is that we found about 3 billion people in the world could not afford a healthy diet in 2020. That was published this year in the SOPHI report. And the maps and maps you see here and the data is available at our Food Prices for Nutrition Data Hub. So you can play with the data and download it there and see how it varies by country. As we can see on the map, the biggest affected areas where the majority of people cannot afford healthy diets are in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is, again, due to the fact that diets aren't cheaper there, but average incomes tend to be a lot lower. So affordability of healthy diets is really an issue. And it's especially an issue for the parts of the diet that are not starchy staples and not oils. So the parts that have not been historically prioritized for research and development, in particular, the fruits and vegetables and legumes. As Jess also mentioned in her talk, we've had this kind of obsession with staple grains in agricultural development and research, and we really see the prices for staple grains being a very small proportion of the cost of healthy diets and other food groups, being the main reason that people cannot afford the healthy diet. But then if we look at sustainability, are these dietary guidelines sustainable? We've used countries' own definitions to define a healthy diet. And in this paper, which Marco and I collaborated on a few years ago, we looked at healthiness and sustainability of national dietary guidelines and found that they don't always have constraints that make them as sustainable as they could be. In conclusion of this paper, one of the things that came out was that there was a need to provide clearer advice on limiting consumption of animal source foods, in particular beef and dairy, which would have the greatest impact on sustainability of dietary guidelines. So that's certainly an important principle for countries to be incorporating into dietary guidelines, and obviously considering sustainability as something that is critically important for long-term health of populations. And so this sort of conclusion is very applicable on a case-by-case basis for individual guidelines. But when we're looking at the average amounts of foods recommended across guidelines, as we did in the healthy diet basket, and the foods that are least cost in each food group, we actually find that the least cost diets, which follow the healthy diet basket, again, the commonalities across guidelines, are comparable. In fact, they have about the same environmental impacts here, looking at greenhouse gas emissions and water footprint, as the Eat Lancet diet. And why is this? Mainly animal source foods. The amount of animal source foods in the healthy diet basket is about exactly the same as that in the Eat Lancet diet. And so that's where we see the biggest impact on greenhouse gas emissions and water. And so lots of times we hear from people, yes, we want the cost of a healthy diet, but we also want the cost of a healthy and sustainable diet. What do we need to do? And the implication here is that we don't actually need to do a separate calculation, that the least cost diets that meet the healthy diet basket global standard are also meeting some sustainability criteria. And we also see, this is similar to what Marco showed on sustainable diets being more affordable than less sustainable diets. We see that the more expensive foods tend to have higher carbon footprints across all the food groups. We see some similar patterns for water footprints, although there's a little bit more variation there. And so this is further evidence that more affordable items also tend to be more sustainable. So there's really kind of a double duty action there in consuming items that are lower on the food chain in terms of both affordability and sustainability. But these data here are only looking at the cost of the item itself and the environmental impact of the item itself and its production. It doesn't factor in other costs around the items. One of those is cooking and the cost of fuel And this is an expansion, it's not factored into the cost and affordability of healthy diets, but it is a frontier that certainly should be considered as one area of full cost accounting, that cost and environmental impact of meal preparation and cooking is not trivial. Here we see the cost per serving of cooking fuel to consume a serving of dried beans in East Africa. And in some countries, the cost of cooking fuel far exceeds the cost of the beans themselves. And so we need to be thinking about low-cost sustainable cooking, and in terms of inclusive diets, that this would benefit from solutions around the whole food system and not only the production of the item itself. So that's been a brief introduction. I just want to acknowledge my collaborators at Tufts, at the World Bank, and at IFPRI, and our funding from the Gates Foundation and UK Aid, and the collaboration and support from FAO as well. And I'll stop there, and I think we have a discussion session. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That was a great talk. And as you correctly pointed out, we are indeed moving into, in my opinion, the very exciting part of the session, which is the panel discussion with all of our participants. So I think from this session, a couple of common themes have emerged. And I think the first and most striking thing is that we can't talk about inclusion in isolation without balancing it against other issues of transformation, of policy changes, of resilience in food systems, of considering in cost, and also factoring in local practices. So I think that's a theme that's going to emerge throughout this event, actually, that although we have split it into 4 sessions, all of them are really very closely intertwined with each other, and you can't necessarily talk about any one of them in isolation. So that said, I want to congratulate our panelists again for a series of fantastic talks, and let's jump right into the questions in no particular order. Anna, I'm going to go with you first, because I was very intrigued by that last slide you presented on sort of choice of cooking fuels, because I don't think this is something that is necessarily thought about broadly when it comes to considering costs of different types of food practices. And there are also serious health implications in terms of which fuel sources are used for cooking. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more upon that, and maybe whether this is not just this choice of fuel, but other aspects around food preparation should also be factored into discussions on inclusion.
Certainly. I mean, you said it exactly. We need to be thinking beyond the food item itself and what it actually means for people to consume. We can see that in the market, dried beans or dried lentils tend to be the cheapest item everywhere around the world for plant source protein-rich foods. And yet, in practice, it's not necessarily the cheapest for people, both in terms of their time, the time it takes to cook dried beans as opposed to, say, a parboiled or canned beans or something that's a little bit more convenient and less time consuming, and in terms of the cost of the fuel itself. And as you mentioned, there are health impacts to different types of cooking practices. And so it's a frontier of the work on costing that, we start with the most transparent information, the most available information, which is market prices, but recognizing that those are not the full costs, and that further work is needed, both for the full costs experienced by the eater and the food preparer, and also, as we tend to think about more often in these circles, the full costs that are borne by other parts of the food system and not reflected in the market prices, that's a big agenda as well.
Thank you. I think another theme that has emerged from all of your talks today is the need for robust data at different levels, whether it is at the individual level or it is at the level of how food systems are functioning. So I'd like to address that question of data and data collection and its importance in a couple of different ways. So I think, Lora, I'm going to start with you, where you talked about your work actually running clinical trials in Africa to understand the impact of nutrition sources and how this can affect child development. I wonder if you could comment on the importance of having rigorous approaches like this to actually have concrete data to work on, and how applicable would it be to run something like this in other parts of the world?
Yes, thank you. I think my colleagues would probably agree with me that it's usually very surprising when you go to do a systematic review, the limitations in the evidence base for high quality data. We face that all the time, and the heterogeneity of the data that's out there. My lab does do randomized controlled trials with a view towards that being, what's considered, high quality, rigorous evidence. On the other hand, I think, we face this tension between efficacy and effectiveness. And in our RCTs, I would say we lean more towards effectiveness, which is, let's test something in a way that works in the real world. So the eggs are a really good example where, people would question, okay, 1 egg per day, is there compliance? That would be a pure RCT. But from our point of view, for example, do they share it with other household members? Well, yeah, of course they're going to share. That's the real world. And so the way we handle that is we would assume intention to treat, there's compliance, but then we also give some extra eggs because they're very low income, low resource settings. So there's a balance between pure RCT rigor and making sure you're testing something that will work in the real world eventually. But yes, high quality evidence is so important.
I did want to add that, doesn't have to be a one-on-one. So if any of the other speakers would like to join in and expand on a point, please feel free to do so and jump in anytime. Marco, I'm going to ask you a question that came up from the audience as well, and is tied into more broadly this question that many of you brought up of this transition away from animal source foods and maybe towards more plant-based foods. And in your work, Marco, one of the ways you've explored that potential transition is through applying a tax, say on meat-based products. Now, the question is from an inclusivity perspective, when you're trying to promote changes in food patterns, taxes may be affordable in certain parts of the world, but definitely not in others, and would really affect food costs there. So really, these kinds of economic incentives or burdens, if you will, how do you see them playing out in a way that is inclusive across different economic landscapes?
Yeah, from my perspective, food taxes can not be in conflict with inclusivity. So we must not forget the reason why we would want to, for example, have a fair and full pricing of foods. The reason for that is really much to encourage consumers to, for example, not buy foods high in, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions or health impacts. So it's correct to say, if people keep eating what they eat and then you tax them, then stuff wouldn't be affordable potentially, and they would pay more. But that's not the intended consequence. So the intended consequence is that households shift somewhat their consumption patterns, and our analyses show that if such a policy measure or fiscal policy measure is successful, then that could indeed be accomplished, and there wouldn't be an increase in the household costs for different diets. Now, that obviously depends a lot on sort of assumptions of how the economic system works. And I think if you want to be on the safe side, then what you do with the revenues is highly important. So if you tax something, you collect revenues. Those revenues you can use to support especially low-income and vulnerable households to help transition to healthier and more sustainable diets through community-based intervention programs, for example, or making other foods even cheaper than they are, so they are more affordable. So there are lots of things that can be done. And based on our analysis, we actually found that you can identify one tax design in all countries that actually results in both environmental benefits and health benefits.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Pauline, I wanted to ask you about something that you raised in your talk, which is that it is not just a question of sustainability in promoting certain types of food transitions, especially to plant-based sources, but it's also a question of health. And you uncovered that plant-based substitutes are often healthier than their animal counterparts. And so the suggestion was that messaging, for example, or communication with people doesn't necessarily have to be about the sustainability aspect alone, but health also can be an important part of that. And you've also mentioned that you've done this in the UK, but then you have experience working in Africa as well. So I'm wondering, in terms of inclusivity, you know, this message of sustainability versus health, what is more important in different locations, and how do you see that resonating with people from different backgrounds?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and maybe it ties a little bit in your previous question as well, and the answer that Marco gave to that, because it has everything to do with alternatives, so if alternatives are there, and in the previous question, in case of a taxation of a certain food, but indeed the food that you want to divert the public to is available at a lower price, or at the same price as maybe the first food was initially, that of course makes a big difference. But yeah, the question in the problem setting in lower income countries or settings is very different. So our work in Europe is very distinctly different from what we do, for example, in the example I gave in the Gambia. And sustainability is certainly very high up the agenda as well. The Gambia is one of the most progressive countries in terms of their NCDs and the sort of targets that they've set for themselves. So that is very similar. But of course, in low resource settings, there might not always be the alternatives that you have in higher income settings. And so, for example, sustainable diets in the Gambia look much more at water. Water is a limiting factor. And so, are there any alternatives for specific foods that are have a very high water footprint, a very high water demand, and are there alternatives that are equally healthy but require less water? And also more a question of resilience. So is this something we can change it now? But is that something that in 10, 20, 30 years from now would still be something that falls within the sort of boundaries that you have given certain scenarios of climate change? It is not true that, of course, if we're talking about settings with very high food insecurity, adding a sort of an extra layer on top of, like, well, we need to have sufficient diets that are healthy and also that they are sustainable, of course, might seem a bit as something that is beyond reason, because we need to make sure that people can eat in the first place. But especially if you tie it in with the resilience aspect, it follows much more of a long-term path, because yes, it might require a certain change, which in a very food insecure situation might not be desirable. But otherwise, if that change is not made, you run into the same sort of problems, but at a later stage, and maybe with more sort of devastating consequences or irreversible damage that is done. But the acute phase, of course, if we're talking about hunger, if we're talking about disasters or so, yeah, all of that kind of falls away, and then kind of providing people with at least sufficient food so that they don't go hungry is the #1 priority.
Thank you. Lora, I wanted to touch upon some aspects of your work that focus on micronutrient deficiencies, because when we're talking about nutritional requirements very broadly, micronutrient deficiencies are a really important component of that. And I know you've looked at that in your own work. So with this broader transition or this broader recommendation to move towards a plant-based diet, especially in areas of the world where micronutrient deficiencies are an important problem, I wonder how these two can be reconciled, or if there are tailored solutions that can be offered that broadly meet sustainability goals, but are also very focused on meeting local nutritional requirements.
Sure, thanks for that question. I think first I'd like to sort of promote the use of nutrient deficiencies as compared to micronutrient deficiencies, because we also see inadequacies in certain fatty acids, for example, the long chain fatty acids, as well as protein quality, which is macronutrients. So I usually like to use the word nutrient deficiencies. I think sort of going back to what Pauline was talking about in those sort of contextual differences, it's really important for us to consider those contextual differences. And then together with that, we need to consider life course differences. So there are vulnerabilities and high risks for those nutrient deficiencies, in particular, life phases or phases of the life course. And that's what we need to really pay attention to in terms of all of what we're promoting here, which I agree with, and moving towards the plant-based. This makes sense from the point of view of adults. But in terms of very young children, it's a different consideration. And those dietary guidelines that Anna was mentioning, some of those do have specific recommendations for children. So if you have no animal source foods, then you're going to be more likely to have vitamin B12 deficiency, for example. But you're also going to have higher risk for iron and zinc and vitamin A deficiencies in young children with the absence of animal source foods. So we need to take good care. I mean, while we're promoting healthy, sustainable diets, to be specific about which life course we're referring to, and protect really young children who are going to be future adults and their brain is still developing and still needs some of these foods that can't be met. Those nutrient deficiencies can't be addressed through even plant-based alternative foods. I hope that is clear.
And if I could jump in here also, I think we need to be clear. The word plant-based diet can be confusing. I don't interpret that to mean a vegan diet, right? We're talking about a high proportion of the diet in foods that are low on the food chain, which are affordable and nutritious and provide diversity of foods in a diet with a balance that meets nutrient needs and includes generally a relatively small amount of animal source foods that are very efficient in delivering nutrient needs and very palatable forms that are, for most people in the world, very desirable as well. So when we talk about plant-based, we have to be careful that we're not suggesting that everyone in the world should become a vegan. Of course, you can eat a healthy vegan diet, but for many people, that's very hard to do with the resources that they have and the food items that are available. So when we're talking about plant-based, we're talking about, yes, including animal source foods generally, but in modest amounts. I think Marco probably has more to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, usually, I usually say predominantly plant-based, right? So I totally agree with that. And I think it's also, having this life course perspective is also very good. And I think one additional aspect here to keep in mind is that lots of studies like the RCTs, for example, that Lora is doing, they look at the current situation, right? So at the current situation and current dietary choices very often differ from what we think would be a more healthy and sustainable dietary pattern for different groups. So, and that comes back to, for example, if you look at reliving vegans, for example, some of them might have deficiencies because they don't look at what they actually should be eating, like all of us, all of omnivores do as well, right? But especially with those specialized dietary patterns, one has to take extra care that you get the composition right. And I guess lots of dietetic societies, including those of the US or Italy, they do provide support if you want to choose a completely plant-based diet for different stages of the life course. And they usually say it can be done, but you need to pay attention to a couple of things. And I think that is important to highlight. So when we sort of use those dietary patterns in our modeling, we make sure we actually have a proper composition of foods in those predominantly plant-based dietary patterns that might differ from what you find on the ground, right? So that is important to say. So nobody wants a sort of very monotonic vegan diet as sort of an aspirational diet, right?
I think you've made a very important point about the importance of diet diversity and not just trying to obtain nutrition from a few sources. And I want to throw in an interesting point that somebody in the audience raised, which is, we've talked about the importance of factoring in life course into some of these recommendations, but also is there tailoring that can be done to other factors, in particular gender? So for example, would there be different recommendations for males versus females? And then how would that play out? I don't know, Lora, if you wanted to address that or if there's somebody else that would like to jump in.
I think we want to be careful and say there are differences based on sex of the individual as compared to gender, right? So if you look at dietary reference intakes, they do divide it by males and females. So there are definitely differences. But then there are the gender considerations, which are kind of, can be cultural based. It can be about the inter-household, food allocation. That's not my area of expertise, is in gender. So if others want to weigh in there, I think that's important. But I do know there are biological differences in terms of the what we need.
Usually when we calculate population level requirements, we factor in different nutrient and calorie needs by sex and age group. Lots of those, I have to say, are fairly old and probably would make sense to express them in different ways than sort of absolute requirements. I mean, they're all mediated by overall intake, right? So expressing them as, for example, calorie densities or so might make much more sense than just say, okay, everybody needs that and that amount. But yeah, usually we do take those into account, and with more detailed data, depending on where and what context you work on, you can really go do some deep dives to see how different groups, socioeconomic groups, do in a country.
And most dietary guidelines in the world do not separate recommendations for food groups by different subpopulation groups. Some of them do. But most of them, all of them present a general recommendation, even if the annex somewhere presents subpopulation recommendations also. And they're usually meant for the general population age 2 and over, most commonly. So the point of a diet pattern that's expressed in dietary guidelines is that this is a general set of principles of proportions that if you follow, you're generally going to be able to meet nutrient needs. Now, of course, when we look at, we've looked at the cost of meeting nutrient adequacy specifically as a different indicator. And we do see that there's differences across different subpopulations. So as you would expect, we see that the total cost of a nutrient adequate diet and an energy adequate diet is actually highest for those who need the most energy. So that turns out to be active adolescent males. But when you look at the cost per calorie, that's highest for generally women, and particularly adolescent girls and pregnant and lactating women have a greater need for more nutrient dense diets, which means a lower proportion of starchy staples, most likely, and a higher proportion of all of the other diverse food groups that are more micronutrient dense. So there are those nuances, but in general, when you're talking about a general population, you can say that overall diet following a similar pattern is likely to be similarly adequate for general nutritional needs.
Maybe just to add to that, of course, food-based dietary guidelines are not day-to-day menus of what you should eat. So there's a very large range of different foods that you can eat within. So diets can vary massively, even although two people are following the same food-based dietary guideline. And I think sometimes having better exposure of the different options is something that we quite like to do, is finding those different patterns. So what are the sort of typical diets that fall within food-based dietary guidelines, and say, well, these are these are people that consumed an average diet in country X before, and these are the sort of alternative diets that they are consuming now, which might be ranging quite widely. And so this is not to say like for different groups, for different societal groups, these are different dietary guidelines, but it's more like this might be something to your liking, or given the sort of diets that you ate before, this might be a sort of like for like swap that you might consider, and which helps with accelerating behavior change.
Great. And we just have a couple minutes left in our panel discussion. So I'm going to throw out one last general question to all of you, and maybe we'll start with Marco, and then all of you can jump in. So all of you in different contexts have a lot of expertise in working with modeling. So using data to build models, and then using those models to infer how real world scenarios might work, and then actually taking information from the real world, feeding them back into your models, improving your estimations, and so on, for different things, as you've demonstrated, around food costs, dietary patterns, and so on. So when it comes to inclusion, I think there's always a challenge about model building, that the data you put into the model and the assumptions that you put into the model when you're constructing it do influence outcomes in a very big way. So I do want to ask you, as all of you have had expertise with, using models to assess real world scenarios, how do you ensure that inclusivity and equity is sort of baked into your initial assumptions and then is reflected in the outcomes from that work? So maybe Marco, if you could start off, and then we would hear from everyone else.
Yeah, very good question. I think it's really important, to distinguish what kinds of questions you are answering, right? So if you're trying to sort of paint a, broad global picture, then that is probably what you look at. But if you want to really dive deep into socioeconomic differences, and I think specifically inclusion relates to those. Well, actually, inclusion can also relate to different countries at the global level, right? So you always have inclusion issues depending on what scales you look at, I suppose. But if we're talking about the more fine-grained inclusion issues and disparities, then I guess having more detailed data is critically important. So at the moment, we are working on breaking down all kinds of health and environmental estimates by socioeconomic groups around the world. So I'm hoping that will provide some data towards that discussion. But I guess no matter what scale you work at, you always have issues that pertain to that.
Perhaps I could also say something about when you're talking about modeling, there's models to predict and there's models to describe. And in terms of the models to predict, there's not much we can do about, we obviously don't have observational data from the future. But for the models that describe, I would very much agree with Marco and further emphasize that we need better observational data for the things that matter most. And so trying not to model a description of the situation, but rather, if we don't have an adequate description, collecting the data that we need. So to also clarify, with the cost of healthy diets that we've done, that is not a model. That is entirely based on actual price data from markets around the world. And so for the purpose of cost and affordability, that's the kind of data we need. For the purpose of environmental sustainability, I think there's big gains being made, but a lot more that needs to happen with regard to adequate data to describe the situation and the environmental impact of foods and production systems.
Pauline or Laura, would you like to take that on as well?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, very much agree with both Anna and Marco. And I think your question kind of very much illustrates our stream of thought, or maybe our learning curve over the years within my group. I think they are different research questions, and so I think the models were helpful. I work, of course, much more on sort of national and local level than the sort of work that Marco was describing. So it automatically means that you kind of get to the stage where you need to start talking to people much earlier than if you work at the global level. And at some point you hit a wall. And I started my presentation with, well, we kind of know more or less what we want to eat, and now what? And so it's almost a sort of natural step from the very useful and informative models to speaking to consumers, to producers, to all the different actors in the food system. But I think our biggest learning curve maybe has been that it's not that's not necessarily the sequence. So there's much more emphasis now also by funders of research projects on setting up PPI groups, patient and population involvement groups, not so that it's never an afterthought, but that they're kind of involved even in modeling studies, and we've showed this in the Gambia. Where we've had all kinds of different stakeholders, and we talked them through a model and what we'd done, and see if there were any assumptions that we needed to change for that. So it's not something that is necessarily too difficult or so for non-modelers to be engaged. But so I think having that a little bit more embedded in research would be good.
I think we're out of time. So I'll say just briefly, I agree with the previous speakers very much. It depends on the research question. But in summary, I'm a proponent of mixed methods. So modeling together with RCTs, together with dissemination implementation research, together with qualitative research, all of that is really going to validate and produce a strong evidence base.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
And with that, we're at the end of this first session on inclusive diets. I think this has been incredibly informative because we have looked at inclusivity from a number of different angles, from a number of different geographic locations, and also different scales, from the local to the global and everything in between. And we've also touched upon some of the existing limitations, for the one around rigorous data collection being the most obvious one, but others. And hopefully this has stimulated some new questions, both for yourselves and for our audience, on how we think about inclusive diets. With that, we're at the end of session 1, and I'd like to remind everybody